immediately after Yom Kippur, there opens up the opportunity and the mitzvah to begin building the sukkah. Why don't you try to actually do that immediately after? Because the idea is that mitzvah goreres mitzvah, that one mitzvah leads immediately to another, and that you should personally involve yourself in building the sukkah. So anyone can build the sukkah. If you are unable to build it for whatever reason, some people have the opportunity to at least contribute a small part of it, such as putting a little more skach on top or closing off the walls. So let's talk about what it means to have a sukkah. So a sukkah has two important components. It has the walls and it has the covering, the roof, called the skach. Okay, so the important thing is to have up those walls before you put the skach up. The reason why you want that is because you want to make the sukkah for the holiday and not use something that's been pre-made. So the first thing you should do when building your sukkah is put up all of the walls. So some people basically say that if you have the skach up on top of, let's say, a wall-less frame on poles or like a pergola, that might be okay, but preferably, in order to make sure that everybody's happy with it, you should really build the enclosure first. So what is the enclosure? The enclosure is at least 3 full sides enclosed. That is the minimum, and it has to be at least the depth of 7 hand breadths. Okay, so it has to be large enough basically for you to lie down most of your body in it, and then it has to be at least 10 hand breadths high. So if it's smaller than 7 by 7 and 10 high, it's not valid. But most people make it large enough to get both themselves and a table inside. And that's sort of like the minimum size that you really need. So for example, if a person was traveling, if you opened up 2 doors of your car, for example, if you opened up the front door, the front driver's seat door, and the passenger seat door directly behind the driver, and then you put some schach in between that, you would have an enclosure on 3 sides. You would have the opposite side of the car, and you'd have the 2 doors, and you could sit there with a little table, and that would be such a great idea for a traveling sukkah. Some people have a pop-up one that pops up that you can use as well, but that's the idea of like the minimum size of a sukkah, enough to kind of sit yourself in and have a meal in there, and be tall enough so that you could fit your body in there comfortably. The truth is that the idea of it being about 10 hand breadths high comes from the height of the aron itself, from the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron Abris, that the covering of the keruvim that went over the aron was that height. And so that's the idea, is that you were basically, that is the part where you are covered beneath the actual physical realm, and above that is kind of the realm where Hashem rests his presence, known as the Shekhinah. So, but there's no maximum size. There's a couple different ways to build a sukkah wall setup. So you could have 2 L-shaped walls and then have at least a little bit protruding on the 3rd side. There's also the idea that you could have the same L-shaped wall and then a parallel wall to that, but then you'd have to build a enclosure on either side of it. So there's a lot of different options, but really the truth is that you should really try to build 3 sides enclosed. So if you have something along that line, that would be preferable. Does it have to be completely closed in? No. You could have poles being close to each other within 3 hand breadths of each other, and that would be fine, but you really should close in on 3 sides. Most sukkah kits actually have an enclosure that goes around pretty much all 4 sides. And so that's the best way to do it. And you definitely have to have the walls going directly under the sukkah. So they have to be an enclosure, so they have to be right, the parts of it have to either be, if you're using different independent parts, to be right next to each other, or the sukkah has to be enclosed in on all the sides. The other thing is it has to be something that could stand up on its own. So it's difficult to permit a frame that holds a cloth in it unless the cloth is extremely taut. So the basic way to avoid that problem is to create a halachic wall on the bottom half of the sukkah, and that way if you want to use a tarpaulin or something along those lines, like a sukkah cover, on the outside, that would be the best thing to do. Because the problem is that you aren't allowed to have the undulation of the amplification on the sukkah wall to go beyond the actual frame itself that would hold it up. So one way you can avoid that problem is to create a halakhically perfectly good wall on the bottom. And the way you do that is along your frame you can tie strings that are within 3 tefach of each other, going up at least 40 inches high, the minimum 10 tefachim. So you would start from the ground of your frame, you would go up about 9 inches and tie a string and have that string taut and tie it to the other side of your frame. Then go up another 9 inches, tie that and to both sides of the frame. Then go up a final 9 inches. So this way you'll be pretty close to your 40 inches. If you're concerned that you're going to go too far apart from each other in measuring your little handbreadths from the ground, you can always move them a little closer, add a fourth one. Nothing's going to stop that. But you want to make sure that you don't have significant amplification on those walls, because then it's not really a wall. You need to have that. You can also use something completely solid as well. Once you have that, you can go ahead and put the skach on top of those frames. And the skach has to be made with material that is what is known as psulas goren v'yakav, things that are basically the leftover materials from when you do a harvest. So it has to be from things that grew in the ground, that aren't a utensil. Very simple, basic material. It can't be complicated stuff. So branches, bamboo, even things that are leaves leaves attached to the branches are going to be perfectly acceptable. So that is part of the integral part of the skach itself, the covering of it. There are people who often use mats. They use a bamboo mat. The only issue with the mats are if they were made to be used for sitting on or laying on, meaning if they were meant to be used for some integral purpose that would have turned them into a usable utensil, they would not be allowed to be used for the sukkah. Another problem would be is if it was using twined rope to hold it together, could also be a potential problem. A kosher sukkah mat, a kosher bamboo sukkah mat would be one that is tied together, knotted together with fishing line or some small plastic simple line to hold all the pieces together. And then those pieces would be attached into a long mat, and then you'd roll the mat out across the top of your sukkah. You need to make sure that the mat is laying on pieces of wood as well, so you want to make sure you have some 1x2s that go across the sukkah and don't let the skach touch the frame. And in that way you'll build a simple sukkah. So you can get a frame, and you can make your halachic walls 9 inches from the ground apart with 3 separate strings up. And then you could wrap a tarp around the entire surface of your sukkah. You would then take wood planks across the top of the frame of the sukkah and take your sukkah mat and roll it across the top. If you're not sure about the sukkah mats, the skach mats that could be used across the top of it, I recommend getting one with a hechsher. But that is how you build a sukkah for the holiday of Sukkot. Chag Sameach.